Chronic wasting disease has been found in British Columbia.
Animals that are infected with this disease, like Caeley described, the symptoms aren't always obvious.
Invasive species like zebra and quagga mussels are knocking on the door of Western Canada.
So they're taking all of the food out of the water, the bottom of the food chain, so that it can't, cascade up to feed fish and that sort of stuff.
Find out what that means to hunters, anglers, and outdoor recreationists this week on Wild Talk. We are back with more Wild Talk. I'm your host, Steve Hamilton.
We are back at it for another social segment on Wild Talk.
You're watching Wild Talk, brought to you by Wild TV Plus and Aventura.
Welcome to another episode of Wild Talk. I'm your host, Steve Hamilton. I'm joined by Cait Nelson and Caeley Thacker from the province of British Columbia. They're both specialists when it comes to chronic wasting disease and disease mitigation in general. So, unfortunately, chronic wasting disease has been found here in British Columbia in the last couple of weeks. And I'd like to thank both of you guys for joining us today and welcome you to the show.
Thanks for having
Steve.
us.
So, I know you both, and but our audience probably doesn't. So let's start with you, Cait. Can you give a little bit of a background on who you are?
Sure. So I'm a wildlife health biologist, work with the BC government, our BC Wildlife Health Program that Caeley leads. I joined the program almost 18 years ago, if you can believe it, when Dr. Helen Swanshaw was running the show. And I got involved in a few different of the programs at that time. After a few years, Helen handed me the CWD file. And at that time, it was, for BC, we were still considered really low risk. It was a disease that we were concerned about. It was having some negative impacts in other places, but it was just, we wanted to start talking to hunters about it, especially hunters that were going and hunting in these places in the prairies and where CWD was currently. But fast forward to the last couple of years now, as the disease continued to spread, obviously our risk level in BC had increased significantly, and so we were really focused on prevention and doing all that we could to reduce the risk of bringing the disease into BC. And so focusing on prevention and surveillance to make sure that we caught it early. We'll talk more about all of this stuff, but more recently, preparing for this event of our first detection in BC, and working with our partners and stakeholders and the hunting community in particular around how we were going to respond once it was detected in BC. So that's been my main focus in my role with the Wildlife Health Program for the last number of years. And here we are.
18 years. Time flies when you're having fun, I suppose.
Yeah, lots of fun, lots of learning. Wildlife health keeps you on your toes for sure. There's always changes and emerging issues and lots to learn. So,
Dr. Caeley, let's throw this to you. You and I go back a few years now, when you were just a shadow to the legend herself, Dr. Helen Swanshaw. So
Yes.
what are you doing now?
That's right. So now I am the wildlife vet for BC. Helen has retired, and I'm following in her footsteps and leading the wildlife health program. So I work with Cait Nelson here and two other amazing wildlife health biologists that we are the team that looks at and surveils for and supports all things wildlife health within the provincial government and beyond. So we work with other stakeholders and partners and communities to learn more about wildlife health and figure out what we can do in some cases when we're lucky enough that there are there are actions we can take and that we can support. So in my role, as I said, I work with the biologists in the ministry, biologists outside of the ministry, communities, the conservation officers. I support their activities, all kinds of different things. Every day is different, and that's what I love about my job. I feel very lucky to be here and very lucky to work with the people and mostly the animals that I get to work with. So I'm very fortunate that way.
Let's get into what chronic wasting disease is. Cait, I'll throw that one to you.
Sure. So chronic wasting disease is a infectious disease that impacts the species in the deer family. So cervids. So that includes, white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose. We believe caribou to be susceptible. We haven't had a case in caribou in North America, but it has affected the same species in Europe. And so this disease is caused by an abnormal misfolded protein called a prion. And these prions will accumulate in the tissue, particularly concentrated in the central nervous system and the brain. And so it leads to a neurological disease, degenerative neurological disease. And so it's fatal in every case. Every animal that becomes infected with CWD will die from the disease. Over a range of 18 months to a couple of years, the animal will usually die. And there's no treatment or vaccine for the disease, so it's been a very challenging disease to try and manage it, particularly in free-ranging populations. So it has affected both captive cervids through the farming industry in some places, as well as wildlife. But it's very hard to manage. Another challenging aspect is that these infected animals will shed the disease agent through bodily fluids and carcasses on the landscape, and so it gets into the environment. And once the prion is in the environment, it's essentially indestructible. They're not destroyed through burning or practical ways to disinfect, like disinfectants. Um, and so once they're in the environment, they will persist there for several years. We don't actually know how long, but it's not feasible to clean up those environments, and so the disease agent is there and has the ability to expose other animals that pass through the area. So it can be transmitted between animals through direct contact, but also indirectly through the environment. And so it's been a real challenge in other places. In the early days, we've watched CWD on the landscape for a few decades now, and in the early days there wasn't much known about it, and very few tools to try and mitigate the impacts. Fortunately, BC has remained free for a while, and we have the advantage now that we've learned a lot from the experience that other places have gone through. So we understand more about the disease now. We still don't understand everything, but there are some more tools available, and some experts now that hold a lot of knowledge through their experience that are there to support us.
So you mentioned other places. I know personally I've seen maps where it looks like it almost originated in the center of the United States, but obviously that's not where it just popped up, I wouldn't think. Where did it come from, and what are its origins, if you know?
We don't know for sure where it originated, but we do know that the first reported cases of CWD were back in the 1960s in the States, in that Colorado, Wyoming area. There was some captive populations, and at that time, there were animals exhibiting disease, but they didn't know what it was. So it was several years later that it was then just described to be a prion disease and this chronic wasting disease. Um, as it was classified. But so those are the first cases back in that area in the 1960s. Um, it seems to have, spread from those locations through other captive populations, moving around a bit with the farm industry, also spilled over the fence into the wildlife populations, and there's evidence that it's moved back and forth over the fence. So it had spread around quite a bit before anyone really understood the disease and how it was transmitted and this ability to get into the environment. That's all pretty recent knowledge. And so in those days, it had spread quite a bit before they were able to kind of start implementing some tools to manage it. So yeah, that's kind of the general consensus. We don't know exactly where it came from, but that's where we first saw it.
And effectively, it was, as you described, Steve, is that it did just appear in the center of the United States and spread from there. As whether that's the actual picture, of where it came from or not, we're not sure. Whether it was a spontaneous mutation or what. But that, from an effective management and understanding point of view, that is what happened.
It's crazy to think that something like that can just sort of appear, but it seems to be the case. What are the chances it like mutated from something? Is that out of the realm, or as somebody who has no idea about disease?
Yeah, no, that could be, and we don't know. So I'm totally speaking on assumptions here, and I'm sure there are people that have done this research. But yes, that is something that could happen. Whether it was a prion that wasn't transmissible at some point, and through some mutation it became transmissible, or something about it changed and that it started causing disease in these animals. We don't know, but that is something that can happen. Yes.
There are some other prion diseases that we know have been around for a bit longer, like scrapie is a prion disease that affects sheep and goats. Mad cow disease, or BSC, is another prion disease that affects cattle, and there are even human forms like Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is there's a variant of Creutzfeldt-Jakob, which was what showed up in people that had consumed BSC infected cattle.
What does it do to an animal? If as a hunter on the landscape, what should I be looking for? What does it present like?
Yeah, so if you think about where it ends up in the body and what it causes on a cellular level, we'll say, or on a microscopic level at least, it localizes in the neural tissue, so the brain and spinal column of an animal. After it's ingested, it makes its way, it migrates to these tissues through metabolism and bodily function, really, and it causes little air pockets or vacuoles around the prion itself. So if you think about, and this is partly where the name comes from. So it's CWD is part of the group of BSE diseases, as Cait mentioned, which are bovine spongiform encephalopathies. And so you think of the word sponge. So it's creating these little air pockets or these little holes in the neural tissue. So you think that normally the brain tissue and the spinal tissue is fairly dense, and it's all made up of little neural connections that are important for that transfer of information between neurons. And when that's disrupted from these holes, that can't happen normally. So you see deer with neurological symptoms. They may be or uncoordinated. They may seem really just behavior changes. So they may seem very lethargic. They may bump into things. They may not, it may be as simple as displaying not behaving as you'd expect. So in human presence, they may not move or run away. to start off with, and then during the course of the disease, because they may not be eating normally and other functions are disrupted, their body condition starts to deteriorate, and that's where the wasting comes from. So they'll, in the end courses, they may appear, if they've lasted this long, very, very thin and emaciated. They often die before that, and so the wasting may not be noticeable in all cases, but that is kind of an end case presentation.
Yeah, the really tricky, and again, another tricky thing about this disease is that animals that are infected with this disease, like Kylie described, the symptoms aren't always obvious. And, what we've seen in other places is that most animals that test positive for CWD look perfectly normal. So the majority of positive cases are found in healthy looking hunter harvested animals, right? So I think that's a really important thing for people to be aware of. And I've spoken to a lot of hunters about this, saying, oh, I didn't submit my deer for testing because it was really healthy, had good fat and everything. And unfortunately, there isn't any way often to visually determine if this animal is infected with CWD. And so it makes it challenging to manage because we don't have that signal on the landscape that something's wrong.
Hmm.
And that's why it's so important to test these animals so that we can find it, because it isn't always obvious, um, especially until the late stages in the disease. And even in places like in eastern Alberta, where they have quite a high percentage of the mule deer populations are now infected with CWD, it's very rare to see the sick animals on the landscape.
I've seen some videos on social media out of
Hmm.
the States, like multiple videos where hunters and people are just walking up and there's big, beautiful white-tailed mule deer and they're just standing there rigid. And these people are, they can walk right up to them. And these deer aren't even moving. They're not reacting the way
Hmm.
you think they should, but they look good. So I'm assuming something like that is affecting them. And you'd have no idea. As a hunter, you'd go, wow, that's an easy target there. But obviously there's
Hmm.
something going wrong.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly. And that goes to also why we see them as road-killed animals too. And
okay.
they may appear normal, but something about their behavior is making them a bit more susceptible to either being on the road or not being able to get out of the way quick enough.
I read that one was a hunter submission and one was a roadkill.
Correct.
Yes, that's right.
Was it both? I've heard mixed reports though. Was it a mule deer and a whitetail, or was it both species? Or
Yes, it was white-tailed doe that was the roadkill,
okay,
and mule deer buck that was the hunter harvested.
okay. And for my own curiosity, what was the conditions of these animals when they were brought in?
Nothing abnormal was reported about their condition. So the mule deer buck that was harvested was reported to be in good condition. An animal that the hunter targeted for consumption, obviously. So nothing abnormal with that animal. And the white-tailed doe, I believe the same. Cait may have more on that, but
Yeah,
it
of course.
was,
Of
yeah.
course, it was a roadkill, and so we don't know. There might have been some underlying, um, situation there that made it more vulnerable to be hit by a car. But when it was collected, there was nothing unusual or abnormal about that animal either.
Getting close to wrapping this segment up. We haven't talked about the samples. What's needed for a sample? Are hunters at risk of losing their trophy parts, we'll say, for their mounts if they do a sample?
Yeah, so the tissues that we need for testing are mainly located at the back of the throat or the base of the skull, and it varies a little bit with the different species. So on deer, we're targeting a specific lymph node at the back of the throat. It's called a retropharyngeal lymph node, and in addition, we also collect the tonsils on deer. And so there are several options for hunters. Hunters are welcome to submit the head of the animal to one of our freezer locations. We don't need the top of the skull or that part of the brain, so antlers can be removed. Um, and just a little bit of the neck still attached, just to make sure that those tissues at the back of the throat are protected. Um, if a hunter wants to do a European mount, we actually don't need the top portion of the head at all. And several hunters are now just submitting the low jaw. And so you can remove the low jaw quite easily. And I know lots of hunters will be aware of this just by following with a knife along the arch at the back of the low jaw bone and cutting around the arch. Will protect those tissues that we need for testing are just located inside that arch at the back of the jawbone. So turning in those low jaws bones with just the soft tissue of the back of the throat provides us with all we need for the sample. We also offer training to hunters, and there's lots of YouTube videos out there. If hunters want to collect the tonsils and lymph nodes themselves, they can submit those in a Ziploc bag with the right information at one of our freezer locations. So several options there. With moose, elk, and caribou, it's a little bit different because we collect different tissues. Still taking the lymph node at the back of the throat, but in addition, we take a portion of the brain stem that's called the obex, and that's located right at the base of the skull. If you remove that first vertebrae, the opening at the base of the skull, you're going to see that's the section of tissue that we need. So, of course, that requires submitting the head. Unless a hunter, again, wants to collect that tissue themselves, we actually just use we try to collect those little grapefruit spoons, that we all had in our cutlery drawer when we were kids. Really narrow little grapefruit spoon is the perfect tool for extracting that piece of tissue. It's very delicate tissue, so some training or studying of a YouTube video would be required for that. But if the hunter wants to keep the top portion of the head, that's an option as well.
So I'm going to add a grapefruit spoon to my pack.
Yes. We advise.
I see a surge in grapefruit spoons being sold online for hunters.
They're hard to come by. Cait and I have scoured secondhand stores.
Yeah, if you ever see one in a secondhand store, that's a great Christmas gift for Caeley and I. We would love that.
Point taken and noted. So let's wrap this up. We've touched on it, but I don't think we can talk about it too much. How important is ongoing surveillance here now that it's confirmed?
It's everything. Yeah, it's we need more samples to know where we stand and to direct our management activities. So, yeah, we hunters, and I guess we're a bit outside of season or at the end of season now. But when we're back hunting, then that's going to be crucial for surveillance, is submitting those heads and getting the tissues we need for testing to monitor the situation, monitor the spread.
Yeah, and making sure that we have the infrastructure in place to support all of that. In the Kootenay region, we have a really great foundation of that. We have several freezer locations. They're available on our website of all of the freezer locations. I'm sure we'll be adding more, but it's always really helpful to us if there are clubs or businesses in the area that are willing to host a freezer. That will just help us to beef up our our systems and make sure that we can get through these samples as efficiently as possible.
Deer move. They don't respect borders. They're migratory. They're a herd animal. They come into contact with a bunch of other animals. So keep testing, keep reporting, and let's do what we can to slow the spread. So I'd like to thank you both for your time today. And I don't want to say I look forward to seeing where this goes, because we want it to stop in its tracks, but we'll all be watching. Thanks for your efforts.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
And we're back with more Wild Talk. Invasive species is a topic that is on everybody's minds right now. We're reading about it in the news. We're hearing about it on social media. Some of them are running rampant throughout North America. And it's just a matter of time before they start knock on our own doors here in British Columbia. So we've got a great guest today, James Littley. Welcome to Wild Talk. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
So James, let's give our viewers a little bit about you. Who are you and what do you do?
I am the deputy administrator for a local government organization called the Okanagan Basin Water Board in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. One of my portfolios in my job is to manage invasive species, and there's two aspects to that. One is we have Eurasian water milfoil here in our lakes, and we've had that for about 50 years, so I run the program to control that. And then the other is trying to prevent invasive mussels from getting into BC and into our region specifically.
Invasive species. It's something you read about, it's something you see in the news, but what exactly is an invasive species?
An invasive species is a plant or animal that basically comes from somewhere else. So it could come from, like I said, Eurasian water milfoil comes from Eurasian area. And when it gets into a new environment, it can often outcompete the species that are already there and displace them. And then it often has no natural predators or, there's no diseases or things that would control the population of those species. So they can often have very negative effects in their new environment once introduced.
Okay, so that's why if you travel overseas, sometimes the customs will say you're not allowed to bring oranges in or fruits and or veggies or something like that. That's kind of the same sort of thing, right?
That's right. And sometimes those veggies or fruits could even have hidden species that are,
Okay,
pathogens or bacteria or whatever that you don't want to get into your supply of crops and stuff.
right. Okay, so you mentioned Eurasian milfoil, and where I am here in central British Columbia, there's lakes that absolutely are filled with some of this green seaweed looking stuff. Is that milfoil? I always hear people refer to it as milfoil. Is that the same thing?
There's lots of different types of native plants in BC, but the ones that are milfoil, that are this invasive milfoil, will form a thick, dense mat on the surface of the water. And they again, because it's invasive, it has a whole bunch of negative consequences on the ecosystems here. And then if it's a native plant species, it'll usually have like beneficial effects on the ecosystem here.
Right. Okay. I've seen video on social media and locally even. There's almost like a tugboat sort of scraper type thing that they run for a couple months out of the summer to. They're pulling out these big mats of seaweed looking stuff. Is that milfoil or?
Most likely, yeah. That's part of what we do. So in the summer, we have a machine that goes down about 5 feet. We cut the top layer of the milfoil
That's
off,
the
and we
stuff, yeah.
collect it and we take it to shore. And then in the Okanagan and Shuswap regions of BC, we're the only two places that actually also rototill the lake bottom in the wintertime while the plant is dormant. And if we can release those roots to float to the surface and die, then the plant won't grow in the summer, or it'll grow a lot less dense.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Yeah, I see them all the time. They almost look like they're out there cutting the lawn type deal, and there's just stacks and stacks of this thick green stuff. So now I can kind of reconcile a little bit more about what it is, because it's always, oh, we're removing the seaweed or whatever they're calling it at the time. And okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. So
And it's funny you use that analogy, Steve, because I use that analogy for the summer harvesting program. It's like cutting your lawn with a bag on. The problem is it
okay.
just grows back and grows back and grows back. So
Oh, it's
um,
nuts.
that one is short-term effective. The rototilling is longer-term effective. And then in the States and in a lot of other places, they use herbicides in the water to control it instead of mechanical means.
Gotcha. Okay, so we touched on, you mentioned mussels, you mentioned the milfoil there. So which I imagine there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of potential invasive species. So if we could dial it down, what are the greatest threats to Canada for invasive species?
Well, I would say invasive zebra and quagga mussels for areas that aren't infested yet, and then they've also probably had the most damaging effect for areas that are infested. So when we're talking about infested versus non-infested, infested includes Ontario, Quebec, now Manitoba, unfortunately, and then it's just started getting into the maritime provinces. And then Where it's not so far is Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC.
Mussels. I keep hearing that one over and over about the zebras and the quaggas. If they're the ones I'm thinking of, I remember seeing videos and pictures of the Great Lakes, and it's absolutely carpeted with these razor sharp looking clams that are attaching to boats and motors and propellers, and literally anything under the surface of the water is just getting absolutely caked with these clams. Are those the quaggas or the zebras?
Yeah, so they're kind of a cousin species to each other. The quaggas are a little bit bigger, and they filter a little bit more water and do some of that stuff. But the other thing is that the quaggas, once they're introduced to a lake, can outcompete the zebra mussels. So in Lake Michigan, when the zebra mussels were introduced, they did that carpeting effect. They were about 900 per square meter. And then when the quagga mussels came in and they displaced them, they grew up to 7,800 per square meter. So the highest density that's in the literature can be up to 700,000 of these mussels per square meter. And they just, like you said, they carpet everything. The reason that they do that is because they've got such a high reproduction rate. You've got one female mussel can produce a steady rate of 40,000 eggs over and over again, like 2 or 3 times in a summer. A large adult female mussel can release up to 1 million eggs if the water is warmer. And so if you even take a low, survival rate of say 20%, in 3 generations, one of those female mussels could produce 64 billion offspring.
That's mind-boggling. What does that do to an ecosystem when you've got that kind of load in such a small area, and then you just extrapolate it across an entire lake body?
It's almost a little bit deceptive because there's 2 aspects to what the mussels do to the ecosystem. The first, like I mentioned, they're filter feeders, and they're actually these super filter feeders down to 50 microns or whatever, microscopic level. So they're taking all of the food out of the water, the bottom of the food chain, so that it can't cascade up to feed fish and that sort of stuff. But the deceptive part is that for a few years you get really clear water, which seems like a nice thing. But then you've got billions or trillions of mussels that start to die off after 3 or 4 years. And now all of a sudden you've got all this rotting biological material in your lake bottom. And I mentioned they're super filter feeders. They're also selective filter feeders. So they'll take some things out, and if they determine it's not good food for them, they kind of coat it in mucus and spit it back into the water. And often that can mean increased toxins like botulism and E. coli going into the water. And then when they die off in these mass quantities, they can promote toxic algae blooms, have all sorts of other effects on the water quality. And then the other thing that they do is they bioaccumulate toxins. So as they're filtering pollutants from the water, they can bioaccumulate up to 300,000 times the level that is naturally in the water. And so if a fish eats them and then a bird eats the fish or whatever, it can kill the fish and it can kill the bird. So they can actually have an effect on species that are diving ducks or whatever as well.
There's a trickle down effect there, that it's not just affecting the water itself, but it's affecting anything and everyone that's using the water, from recreational fishermen and boat users to the fish, to the birds, to the plankton, even if they're that effective of feeders. Where did they come from? How did they get to Canada and North America in general?
Well, they came from the kind of Caspian Sea region over in Ukraine, and they've been around, known about for several hundred years. But what really allowed them to start moving was people digging irrigation and transportation canals in Europe. And so once the boats started moving between various water bodies and the water moved with it, the species in the water started spreading. And so they've been spreading across Europe for a couple hundred years. And then they were introduced in 1988 to the Great Lakes. And they figured that it probably came over in the ballast of one of these big container ships that gets into the St. Lawrence Seaway. They would have taken on water and like fresh water in a port in Europe and then come across the sea without exchanging that water. If they had exchanged the water with salt water, then it would have killed the species. But if they brought it all the way across and then they dumped their ballast in the St. Lawrence River, that's how it would get into the Great Lakes in the first place.
Canada and North America is mostly freshwater, so the danger is real for these things taking hold and doing some real damage to an ecosystem. Are they edible? I've seen that one on social media. Oh, this could be a good thing here. If they get here, there's like a free for all. There's a buffet for people. Are they edible?
I've heard that too. They're definitely not edible. I mentioned the toxin bioaccumulation. You wouldn't want to eat them. You'd risk poisoning yourself. But also, each mussel is only about the size of your thumbnail. And so they're these tiny little critters, which helps to explain the density that they can grow to. And like I said, the things that do eat them often die from eating them.
Okay, so like a permanent red tide type thing, but in freshwater, like the accumulation
Yeah,
of toxins.
that might be a decent analogy. Yeah.
Birds die, fish die. You mentioned that they are the size of your thumbnail, and that's I literally looked down at my thumbnail and went, that's smaller than I would have figured. So, how are they identified? What are the key factors if I'm walking in a river or a stream and go, hey, wait a minute, that's a clam. Is that an invasive species? So, what's some key factors to identify?
So the first thing is whether or not it's attached to something. So none of our native mussels in North America attach to things. And so these mussels grow these little strings of proteins called byssal threads, and each mussel can grow about 600 of them. They're a problem in themselves. Even if you clean them off, the byssal threads can remain and they trap bacteria and stuff. And then that can become corrosive to whatever surface they're attached to. So I hadn't mentioned infrastructure, but obviously when they're in their larval or egg stage, they're microscopic, so they can get into anything where water goes, and so they have devastating effects on infrastructure, cost a ton of money. But for identifying them, yeah, at maximum size, they're the size of your thumbnail. They're considered adults when they form a shell, but they can still be like the size of a grain of sand when that happens. So they're very, very, very small. The other thing for zebra and quagga mussels, the reason they're named that is because of the patterns on their shells. So the zebra mussels have kind of like a black and brown striped pattern, and the quagga mussels are a little lighter, like a tan striped pattern. And so that's why their name is like that.
Okay, that makes sense. I should have put two and two together. I thought it was way too obvious to that. Well, maybe they're colored like them, but they're colored like them, and they're tiny. That's 700,000 is it's an impossible number to wrap your head around when you do the math of how dense that is. And then you look at Lake Michigan and the rest of the Great Lakes, and knowing that they are overloaded with these things. So let's dig into the infrastructure part. What does it do to infrastructure? I know some of these places have water cooling that they pull out of the lakes, and I've read stories and some literature doing some research for this, that some of these places literally have 2-foot, 3-foot diameter pipes that they're pulling from the lakes to do cooling on their machinery and their buildings, that they have to shut down for a year at a time. They alternate between the two. So they have one going and they're cleaning another one out for a year type thing. What are they doing to the infrastructure?
Well, they spread super fast and they grow super fast. And so you could take a 2-inch diameter pipe and put it into a lake, and within about 6 months, it'll be completely clogged with these mussels. So in the Great Lakes, when they were first introduced, the region was spending about $500 million a year to just clean their infrastructure. You mentioned now that some of these systems have been twinned. So, some of the power generating plants in the Great Lakes used to have only one water intake for cooling. Now they've had to build a second intake so that they can shut it down and clean one at a time. I also mentioned the byssal threads and the bacteria. So they're corrosive. If they attach to basically any surface, concrete or steel or wood pilings or whatever, they'll corrode that material that they're on and weaken it. And then if it's a water supply system, that can change the flow and velocity of the water and have other effects. The other part is that their shells are, they're small, but they're still hard material. And so they grow in these thick clumps. And when they break off, the shells go into the equipment as well. So if you've got pump turbines or generating turbines, things like that, they can increase the wear on the system as you're basically introducing, like a sanding material into there.
Our wildlife and habitat and fish and waterways are just so brutally underfunded here in Western Canada. And it's almost like they're forgotten. And again, opening my eyes to things I didn't know, that I had no idea there was no legislation in place that made things like this law, where you had to remove a drain plug. It seems like something so simple to slow down a spread of something like this, that it's I don't get it sometimes. I really don't get it. I've said it a bunch of times with this show that I don't understand why our wildlife and habitat, it seems like throughout North America, is almost a forgotten it's a forgotten thing. So you touched on best approach to stop them from getting here. And as we wrap this up, James, what can people do if they feel like they have found any? You mentioned a brief description there, but what can people do if they feel that they have found any invasive mussels?
So take a picture of it, note where you found it. I'd say don't pick up or move any mussels where you find them, because they also could be at risk or endangered native mussels, and we don't want to disturb them. Also, if you're going to send the authorities out to look at it, they need to know where to find it, and so you don't want to move it and that sort of thing. But you can take a photo and phone your local conservation officer service. I know in BC we have a line called Report All Poachers and Polluters. That you don't have to be reporting a poacher or polluter. You can phone that line and they'll help you with the conservation officer. And that's the best approach. And I'm sure that there are similar lines, hotlines in other jurisdictions. And I would just say, don't hesitate to phone if you think you've found something like that. If it's in a small lake or reservoir, there might be things that could be done. If it's in a big lake like Okanagan Lake, we're not going to be able to do anything. We need to stop them from getting here in the first place. And that's partly just responsible boating behavior and more action and more funding from the senior levels of government.
Some great points, James. I mentioned before we started recording that I had a person, a concerned citizen here, email me a picture that they thought was an invasive mussel, and they did exactly what they should have done. They took pictures, they GPS marked it, they Google Earth shot where it was, they took pictures of the background. They literally did everything perfectly, including escalate it to the right people. And we escalated it to the biologists. They included the Invasive Species Council. And I honestly was very, very happy with the response we got from the province there. They included everybody, and happy to say that these were not invasive mussels. So we need more and more of that. If there's something that's a little bit off, there's something that's caught your eye, you need to report it. We've got all the resources here, and we've got great people like James leading the charge to slow what we can here and stop what we can. So key takeaway: clean, drain, dry. You heard James mention it. And do your part to slow invasive species. James, thanks for your time today. We'll see you again.
Thanks. Thank you.
You're watching Wild Talk, brought to you by Wild TV Plus and Aventura.